On to file item number 8, data to decision-making science governance.
Reiner, is everyone present, or do we need to take a break?
Present.
Okay,
Yes.
great.
Well, I guess we can
We can squeeze 5 in.
It's a fine-looking group you've gathered together. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and council members. I'm Reiner Honicke, and I have the pleasure to introduce our final data to decision-making information item in our summer series, and it focuses on science governance. In this final panel in the series, the Council will hear and hopefully participate in a discussion regarding science governance. In order to explore and better understand, the panel will discuss the concept of science governance, how the Delta Science Program and the Delta Stewardship Council's approach involves science governance, and how common, or how many commonalities there are and how many differences there are between the Ocean Protection Council and the California Ocean Science Trust with regard to implementing science governance for the California coast versus what the council, the Delta Stewardship Council and the science program do in regard to the Delta and Suisun Marsh. Today's panel is intended to provide an overview from multiple perspectives. Not only will the panelists discuss the Delta Science Program and how it works with the Delta Stewardship Council in support of collaborative science governance, but also the current thinking about science governance as a whole. And we have the pleasure of having Dr. Mark Lubell here again. You may recall you were here last in January, right? And Mark is an expert about governance networks, so he will be able to weigh in after our own lead scientist provides sort of a general overview of how the council and the science program interact with each other. And then the panel will also present you will hear the other panelists with regard to how the Ocean Protection Council interacts with the Ocean Science Trust in order to provide relevant and usable information for coastal and near coastal and ocean management. So let me introduce our panels to you. John Callaway will go first. Dr. Mark Lubell is a professor of environmental science and policy and the director of the Center for Environmental Policy and Behavior at UC Davis. Deborah Halberstadt is the Deputy Secretary for Ocean and Coastal Matters and also serves as Executive Director of the Ocean Protection Council. Dr. Liz Whiteman is now relatively new, like since May, the new Executive Director for the Ocean Science Trust. And I'm really pleased to have them here, and welcome to all of you. John, if you don't mind sort of kicking this discussion off with your thoughts, and then we will follow up with Mark. And I think you have a presentation, right? Some slides.
Great. So I'm going to give you a brief introduction to governance issues here for the Science Program and the Stewardship Council. And as Reiner had said, when we think about governance, really how we organize ourselves, how do we make sure that when we think about science governance, it's how are we effectively identifying the science issues that are important and need to be addressed, and then, as this whole series of panels has discussed, how do we take that science and ensure that it's being used in an effective and useful way for decision making. So I'm going to give a brief overview that I think most of the council members will all know about, so it's as much for the panelists and for others to think about how we're organized here within the council and the science program. So on the slide here, you can see that the science program is a part of the Stewardship Council and was set up specifically in that way to be a part of the Stewardship Council. And inherently, there's some tension between the science program being independent and being an independent body within the Stewardship Council. I think that's healthy tension, but it's something that we need to be mindful of. And I think it's also important to identify that the council is very aware of this and very recognizes the value of an independent science program. That if the science program is going to be credible and be able to identify the critical issues regardless of policy implications, there needs to be independence. And in order to ensure that independence, two important things to identify on this slide here are on the left-hand side. So my role as the Delta lead scientist was set up particularly sort of outside of this whole framework. So I'm the only federal employee within the Stewardship Council. I have an unusual position, I always say, where I work for a private university paid for by a federal institution to work for a state agency. And but it was set up, that the lead scientist position was set up specifically and supported through USGS. And when I interviewed for the job and spoke with Mark Sogi, who's my boss at USGS, we talked a lot about why USGS was committed to maintaining that position for the lead scientist, so that there was independence for the lead scientist to identify any kind of critical issues regardless of the policy implications.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Just following up on Dr. Callaway's comments about the independent role of the science. You know, from my world, being a local elected official representing the Delta, your independence is critical, because we've often heard that, let me put it bluntly, the fix is in, you know, the science is, and so your independence, your recommendations, your suggestions are certainly paramount to making sure that this body is seen as an independent body as well. So I appreciate what you do and your independence.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, and I appreciate, I think throughout the council and the staff, there's strong recognition of that, as I've said. So I think the awareness of that is clearly there and valued. And then separately, the Independent Science Board was also set up as an outside review body, an outside group of experts to provide some additional evaluation and oversight of how science is used, both within our relationship of the science program and the Stewardship Council, as well as the broader science community within the Delta. So next slide. So I put this up just to highlight for the science program. Our mission really is to provide the best possible unbiased scientific information to water and environmental decision making in the Bay Delta system. So we're really, our role there is to provide that science regardless of the policy implications, to really identify what science information comes to bear on these important decisions. And I won't go through all of the objectives, but really the science program facilitates and supports science through our support for competitive research grants, through supporting the science conference, and a broad range of other activities. Adaptive management, communication of science are all important roles that we play to ensure that science has this role in decision making. And it's important to note that the science program both works with the council to address those issues of science that are of concern for the council, but also, just as importantly, works with the broad range of scientists and decision-making and other agencies within the Delta community. So we interact significantly across that wide range of communities. But so thinking about this, one question to think about is, within the science program and the Stewardship Council, what is the best structure to facilitate this, the use of science and this data to decision-making process that we've been talking about? And we'll hear from the Ocean Protection Council and the Science Trust about how their relationship has been set up. We've heard recommendations about for a JPA as a potential structure. So there's many different ways that this could be set up. And one thing we want to think about is that particular relationship. What ensures a high level of communication and a link between science and decision making, but allows for support for science and independent for science. And then separate from that, there's the broader science community. So this figure, this is a network diagram that was developed by Matteo Robbins that I think we've shown before, and that is a part of the update to the science plan. Matteo is a Sea Grant postdoctoral fellow here at the science program and was a PhD student with Mark, has worked significantly on this idea of network analysis and how to understand how organizations work together. And so this diagram shows you the black dots are the collaborative institutions within the Delta science and management community, organizations like DPIC, the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee, organizations like the Collaborative Science and Adaptive Management Program, the IEP, the modeling community. So there's 12 different organizations that are identified there, and then all the others are those who participate in those collaborative institutions. And you can see it's definitely a spider web. It's really a enormous overlap amongst those different participants and communities. And so the other question is to think about, is this broad community, is there anything we can do to organize the broad community in a more effective way to ensure that science is used in a valuable way for decision making? And this shows all of the organizations, state, federal, private, that are involved in any of those. To make it a little bit easier to interpret, this graph shows you, or this diagram shows you that same network, but if you take away all of the organizations that are only involved in one single collaborative group, which are a large percentage, this shows those that are involved in multiple ones. It still shows a large amount of overlap. I think some overlap is real. Redundancy is a good thing in many ways, but again, what we do want to think about, what we do want to think about is there a way we can more effectively organize ourselves across the broad community? And so those are the things I wanted to set up, and I'll turn it over to Mark, unless there's some questions.
Any questions of John?
Just never get all these people in the same room.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I have one.
Susan?
Is there a secret decoder somewhere to the acronyms and
Yes,
abbreviations?
there is a secret decoder, and I believe it is in your binder.
Okay, thank you.
As one of the attachments. And if it isn't in your binder, we'd be happy to provide
Okay.
it for you.
Thank you.
That identifies all of those.
Well, since
We'll have a trivia at lunch, prizes.
since we're talking about the decoder, one thing that would be helpful is to add another column and put an individual or a partner's names that are responsible for those, because it's good listing the organizations, but there generally is somebody in charge, and it would be good to have that listed as well. So, is Mark
All right,
next?
we will pass on the baton to Dr. Lubell.
So I had a couple slides. Not sure exactly how to get them up here.
Looks like Southwest's route map.
Who's the?
The next slideshow.
Okay, that's the correct one. All right, well, thanks to you all for having me visit with you again. I really appreciate your attention to governance issues and integrating social science into the discussion here, including from people like myself who bring a broader perspective than just the economics perspective, which is important, but not the only perspective to deal with. So it's been interesting to me over the last year and a half or so when we've been interacting, and I've been talking to people also in the Bay Area around sea level rise, that people have asked the question about what is governance, and so there's a few thoughts on the academic perspective on that to give you some perspective on it, I suppose. And it's the proverbial elephant, even in academics, which that there's many perspectives, and you have to kind of take all of the perspectives into account to really think about it holistically. So one way to think of it is about the set of rules that govern how people make collective decisions, like what is the jurisdiction of the Delta Stewardship Council, what's the link between the Independent Science Board and the council, and things like that. Another way to think about it is how you govern the network, so network governance, and thinking about that sciencescape that was just shown, and how to integrate and get all the actors there linked together and coordinated, and who knows who in those things and who does what. Another way to think about it is collaborative governance, in terms of figuring out how to get people to work together and collaborate across that network, and actually do something that's good for the whole of the system rather than the individual parts. And then adaptive governance is the idea that you're trying to look at how the system is capable of changing over time, learning new information, dealing with shocks to the system, but remaining resilient in the face of those shocks, and paying attention a lot to the temporal part. So those are all perspectives, and I guess one of the important things for me there is that those perspectives on governance are not specifically about science governance, right? Those are perspectives on governance for anything. We could be talking about health policy, education policy, environmental governance, governing how Norwegian handball is played. I mean, that's literally some Norwegian handball sports talent people use some of my research. It's my favorite example. Applying it to governance in general, we know it's going to be messy, and this is the diagram again of the sciencescape, and there's Matteo there who provided that diagram, and he's working on a report about that right now, investigating more qualitatively what's going on in the sciencescape and what some of the challenges are. So I think everybody should be looking forward to that report. I'm working with him, in conversation with him as he's doing that, so that we can discuss what's in there. And then there's a quote from Phil Eisenberg, who I think most of you probably know who he is, as far as a response to a paper that we wrote about this that says, it's always a mess, let's figure out how to manage a messy situation. I couldn't agree with that more. There's some benefits and costs to this mess, and the question for science governance is really how to get the most out of the mess without trying to unify it into some single kingmaker science program, which I don't think is probably the right way to go. There's some value to having this decentralized system. And what goes on in this system is that the knowledge is distributed across lots of different nodes, lots of different actors, lots of different forums. They're paying attention to different parts of Delta and California water, and even more globally what's going on. And that distributed knowledge has innovation is occurring within that. So how to maximize and integrate that without losing the flexibility and capacity of the system to change and be flexible over time is a key thing.
This is, this is really amazing, because I'm, right now working on, in LA County, they're passing a measure, trying to pass a measure, it's called Safe and Clean Water, which taxes the properties for their impermeable space and then surfaces, and then builds stormwater capture facilities. And if this measure passes, they're going to raise like $300 million a year. And there's this whole idea of who's going to govern the $300 million, because they have to start producing or building, planning the stormwater capture facilities. They're huge infrastructure facilities. And then you have the city, the county, the smaller cities, in who's technically in charge. And then you have the political offices, you have the council districts and the mayor's office and the county supervisors. And this is such a huge issue right now of discussion for us, and all the agencies are coming together to understand what is the governance structure, and is there at the end a king that at the end says, technically I know how to build this, so you can bring me the project, you can tell me what's good, but I'm going to be the one who's realizing it, so I have to be the king. So this is, it just came up because it's the past 2 weeks that I'm dealing with this governance issue, and I appreciate what you did, very helpful.
Well, I will say that those two issues are ubiquitous in every single system that you look at. There is no system in the world that's not messy in some fashion like this. Actually, in my view, democracies produce this mess in even higher rate than other systems, and that's actually a benefit because there's a lot of opportunities for people to participate, come up with their own ideas, and that's one of the huge benefits of a democratic system, because there's that creativity as a society is possible. And that's not something you want to lose.
I think the challenge is at the end it has to get done, and who will make it happen is important, because it requires the technical knowledge, the know-how, and the ability to perform and build and operate and maintain something.
Right, in San Francisco, they're going through the same thing with about major AA and how to spend that money around restoration projects. And so it's a...
Thank you, anyways. Thank you for...
Okay, so another important principle in all of these ideas these systems is the idea of boundary spanning. So there's what the Independent Science Board is doing, and a lot of these science to policy forums are doing, is trying to span the boundaries between science and policy. And the idea of boundary spanning is, there's a guy named David Gustin who's done my favorite work on this, and so this is my adaptation of his work to a program we had at UC Davis. Some of you may know about the Climate Change and Water Society Graduate Training Program. And the key thing for boundary spanning is that you have these idea of boundary objects, which are kind of the like a model or a scientific report that is capable of communicating to the goals of the scientists and the policymakers, right? Something they jointly produce that makes sense to both of them. And but you also have to and those are the things that are so useful to decision makers and are often input into decision making. But in order to produce those, you have to have participation incentives on both sides, right? That people have to have reasons to come together in the context of these forums and work across these boundaries, and that you have to have accountability to both sides. So it's got to be a two-way street when you're crossing these boundaries, and you see this a lot when you have science to policy issues where you're from my side as a scientist, the policymakers are asking people to do things really quickly, with not a lot of money and that sort of thing. But we have incentives that we're facing as scientists that want us to move slower. We have costs that we have to incur and stuff like that. So there's just that sort of conflict is a key issue, and it's not just between science and policy, but between two different agencies or between environmental groups and environmental interests and development interests. All these different boundaries need to be spanned in these systems. So here's what I think some of the goals are. Science governance, identify the best available science. I have that in quotes because that's really kind of the legal standard that I think everybody tries to aim for, because when we're talking about environmental documents like EISs and EIRs and whether or not they're going to be litigated according to this or that, most of the laws require best available science. And so how do we make sure that that is available to decision makers to be integrated into decision making? How do you get consensus about what is real out there? How bad are the striped bass problems, and what's causing them? What's the salinity issue? What do we know about the system that we can agree on, and where the disagreements are too, where we need to aim for getting it? Delivering scientific knowledge to the right people at the right place at the right time. The decision-making is distributed. It's customized often to place exactly what needs to be. Then the timing is crucial. I think this is a big issue between science and policy, getting the timing right, because policymakers often want stuff right now, and they need it now. The legislative session is happening next, but the scientists are like, whoa, we need more data, that sort of thing. And how to manage that is is one of the big challenges.
You have to realize we got elections that are happening.
Yes, sir. I absolutely realize that, waiting for our 99th percentile confidence interval to be achieved is a difficult thing, even in the very long term. So there's always scientific uncertainty. How to make decisions in the face of that remain credible to the public and other stakeholders is a crucial issue that science governance needs to try to help deal with. Funding scientific research is obviously a big deal, and keeping it going, because you need, especially in a system like the Delta, is extremely dynamic, right? We have these changes happening over decades of times. If we're not studying them for a long time period, we're not going to really be able to give any good solid attribution about what is going on there. So we've got little fragments of observations of the natural system and the social system fragmented over time. Then what are really the dynamics? And we're trying to set up an adaptive system here that can last centuries, right? Not just the next 10 years, but how do we establish something that's going to last well beyond us to serve California and the world? How do you make sure that the system can innovate? It's not like we're sitting here with a piece of science or a set of problems that's static. There's scientific uncertainty, there's new ideas, new methods, new theories, new problems come on board. If you don't have systems capable of dealing with those adaptively, then we're not going to be able, the system's not going to be able to change in the right way over time. Translating the science into policy terms, most of you probably don't care a whole heck of a lot about what's under the hood of a statistical model or a really detailed computational model, but you want to understand the bottom line policy implications of that model and trust that the scientists that are delivering that information are doing the right thing and doing it in an even-handed manner. Integrating across that network, so we have lots of different types of knowledge being developed across that network. How do you bring it together in a useful manner? Maintaining legitimacy and independence, as was spoken about before. Those are all, to me, all really important goals that science governance. So what I'm trying to get at there is that governance is a term writ large, but when applied to science, these are kind of what you're trying to aim for. Get governance to try to get to these goals, I think, are the best, or at least my starting list of goals that we ought to be looking for. I mean, that's not I wouldn't say that, everybody would agree with these goals, or you probably have others in mind, or maybe we could simplify them. Best would be to get fewer goals so it's easier. But anyways, those are my thoughts on that. And then when you look at things like the JPA proposal, the Joint Powers Authority, what are the marginal benefits of that Joint Powers Authority with respect to that goal? And when I say marginal benefits, it's not like you're going to be sitting there taking the JPA, and the JPA is going to be the king of that sciencescape. The JPA will become a piece of that sciencescape. And as a piece of that sciencescape, is it going to provide marginal benefits that are help achieve those goals? From the blog, no single state agency has authority or capacity to guide the implementation of the ecosystem management actions. We know that's true. We know it from the thing, but let's put a JPA in. I would argue that you have to also apply that same exact statement to the JPA. No single JPA or science body is really going to have the authority to govern all of it, and probably should not, in my opinion.
Dr. LaBelle,
yes,
sorry
sir.
to interrupt, but you
Yes,
might want
ma'am,
to,
sorry.
I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with the blog and who
Yeah.
wrote it and what the proposal was, so you might want to.
Yeah, so the proposal is to create a JPA, a Joint Powers Authority, which my understanding needs some sort of legislative authorization eventually, or at least there's a legislative process that's out there to set it up. And that Joint Powers Authority, apparently, this is my understanding of it, somebody can help fill in the details, would be to, I guess, get the state agencies who have a stake in the science to provide a more a institution that allows them to share decision making, and I think the most important thing is have a more sustainable flow of funding that integrates across their different science plans. So, and then specifically to support the water quality control plan updates, which is maybe my primary worry about this, which is the water quality control plan is not the only game in town with regard to the Delta. There's lots of different things, and having the science be narrowly, I mean, that's definitely important and a crucial issue happening right now, but having the science be narrowly targeted of a JP being narrowly targeted around that misses, to me, a lot of the other really important pieces, not just about the Delta, but how the Delta also links to the rest of the state. So there's, you would kind of create a container of science and highlight that and possibly lose out on what's going on with the rest of the sciencescape out
Does
there.
the Delta have a specific water quality plan, or it's common with the rest?
Well, my view, I mean, there's the update of the water quality control plan, which is under the Water Resources Control Board's purview,
Yeah.
which is what I think that they're referring to there. But then there's the Delta plan of the.
Yeah, but no, I'm saying the Delta's, the plan for the Delta is the similar in terms of TMDLs and all that it is for the other water bodies, or it's more specific?
Yeah, well, I mean, my understanding is that with what the water quality control plan
Specific.
is basically an update of the basin plan under the auspices of the Clean Water Act and the 1969 Port of Cologne Water Quality Control Act. And every designated water body in the state should have one of those water quality control plans that supports the designated beneficial uses
Being
of that
specific
water body.
to that water body.
Yeah.
But then the plan that you just talked about, Port of Cologne and all that's not updated for a very long time.
Port of Cologne's the overall
Right.
state law, so
Right.
that's permanent as far as I know.
Yep.
I may elaborate a little bit on this one. The Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan is actually the basin plan that the State Water Board produces that's complementary to the Region 5 Central Valley Water Quality Control Plan.
That's what I'm asking.
Right.
Exactly.
And the reason for that is because there are two different regional boards involved, and then it goes to the state board. It's just a procedural thing.
Okay,
that
that's what, because I knew there
multiple
was this.
regions get done by the state board.
Got it, yeah.
And it includes also water rights.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for the explanation.
Okay, so if all the science goes to the JPA, another worry that I have is that it might be a little too inflexible, right? Kind of, there's not room on the edges for different ideas, and that the power will be kind of concentrated among those people who are kind of in the science club around the Delta, rather than having it a little bit more distributed across just for the flexibility of the system. So there's a bit of a trade-off in those 2 points. However, the money part I think is definitely useful. I think having the idea that there's some more sustained pre-commitment to integrating some of the money, I think is the more useful side of the thing. So now I'm kind of, there's parts of it I like, parts of it I don't like, but I definitely don't think that the JPA should be looked at as like the magic bullet that's going to solve all this. It may be beneficial, but it's not going to be the magic bullet. I mean, one way to think of it is you go back to the sciencescape, the network here. It's like, let's take a JPA and integrate, have it be a memorandum of understanding between different agencies. Well, where are you going to draw the circle in the sciencescape to do that? Which of these circles are you going to choose where these are ostensibly have some relationships between each other because they're closely linked in the network diagram? You could kind of draw a circle anywhere and think about integrating in the context of JPA the functions and or agencies that are involved. Which one are you going to choose there to maximize the benefits of a new forum of the JPA that would integrate? Or if you even want to think of it more narrowly, which ones would you select to be part of the JPA that would most closely support bringing the best available science to the narrow confines of updating the water quality control plan. It's not obvious from there exactly which ones you would choose. So that's all I have to say.
No, this is really interesting because it's an issue we've been talking and struggling about, and maybe my question's kind of on the simpler side is, what is the driver behind the JPA? Is it to manage the flow of information or the funding, prioritization of funding, because and this is something we've sort of worked our way through, and I look at this, the decision makers sort of line up as US EPA, State Water Board, NIMS, Fish and Wildlife Service, I'll throw in CDFW, and it's a very permit-driven process. And the JPA, is managing the science, and how, it's sort of, how do you, all these processes are feeding into the decisions of very few. And I sort of looked at it, the more I understood this, it became more of a collaborative process to try and get them information that they could use, which sometimes they don't use because there's risk involved in this. So what, by taking this diffused system and having some central authority, besides money is power, and you can sort of, at least you can prioritize funding and get people to, sort of work together if they're going to get the funding. What else do you get out of that, overlay here?
Well, I mean, I think that the thought behind that JPA, so let's say you pick one of those circles, is that you would get those agencies more consistently in the room together, kind of coming in, agreeing with each other. If you imagine each of those black squares as a place where science is being produced and governed right now, would it be more efficient to produce and govern that science by bringing those black squares together, essentially, and targeting the science, centralizing it more, and funding it more consistently? That's kind of the idea. And I will say it's a very common reaction to when you look at these messes, to try to say we are going to put one person in charge and we're just, everybody else is going to be, bow to the king of science there. And there is benefits to integration, but there's also costs to it. And the right ways, for me, the right way of thinking about it is what's the right way to balance that, right? If it's, you could keep the system like this. You got to say, what if you keep the system like this? And maybe this map is enough, right? It's kind of like you're going to a market in Europe and you want to know where like the best fish is. You got a map and you kind of know where to go shopping now. And that alone gives you, and you want to assemble the meal. Maybe the meal needs to be different for different people for different decisions. Well, now you got a nice map here, but are we going to take everything and all the different counters in the market? You guys been to like Barcelona, the big market there is incredible, but it's really hard to find everything. But if you kind of like put it all in one place, it kind of loses that diversity. That's also important for the benefits of the system. So it's just not, for me, it's never a clear winner that you just integrate and centralize, and that's always the thing that people leap to first, but it's not to me just the.
So where should you leap to?
Yeah, I knew that question was coming. I mean, it's worth considering. It's worth considering all these other models. If you're going to do a JPA, think about different pieces and different models of it. Which of these circles would you try? These circles here, were like throwing a dart at a dartboard. There's no sense to them beyond just illustration purposes. But I wish I had that answer. We're working on that. Trying to figure out. I just had this question. You go to these network diagrams, and what's the best practice that you get out of this, or what's the top 2 target recommendations that you get out from the analysis of this? The science, our social science is not there yet. We're still trying to convince people that these messes are worth looking at. And then talking to people like yourselves and interacting with people like yourselves to hear how you navigate the mess. And that's the back and forth between the social science and the policymakers that for me is where I'm at. Because you guys live this every day. So if I can get the feedback and start thinking about it this way, then eventually I think we hope to get science to a place that we can look at these and have more specific recommendations right off the bat.
And I think this is a good segue because Deborah and Liz will be able to give you an overview of a different model that has also benefits as well as some challenges associated with it. And then maybe we can circle back again and, and then answer some of the questions that Marky has put out there. So I'd suggest maybe that Deborah share with you next how...
You can suggest that, but Susan and Skip have asked to engage.
Sorry.
That was a good suggestion.
Thank you very much for these diagrams and being here today with us. You've really caused me to think a lot about my experience in 30 years of water management. I have a question that maybe if it can't be answered today, can answer later. One of the things I've noticed from the policymaker standpoint is that we often look for consensus from the scientists. And there's combat science out there. And as you said, kingmakers and money has power, etc. The difficulty I've struggled with is to what degree of consensus should I strive when I'm listening to all the scientists and they're disagreeing, but they're all experts, and depending on the issue, for example, if it's health and water quality that's influencing the health of a community versus endangered species on the brink of extinction, I don't have in my mind the scientific degrees of consensus that I should be searching for in this decision about a policy that is supposed to be based on best available science. Do you have a recommendation on degrees of consensus that I should heed in decision making?
Well, I guess one thing I feel fairly comfortable saying is that you should not expect to wait for 100% consensus in order to make a decision, because I think that's very rare for it to occur, even among scientists that are not engaged in combat science. In other words, people who are doing the science because they legitimately have different views. They're legitimately seeking to understand the policy issue, or in the causal processes driving it, but they don't. The methodology or whatever, the knowledge is not mature enough for 100% consensus. So you should never wait for 100% because that's, I think, a bit of a fantasy, even in the most, some of the most agreed upon things. There's still some dissent, with the exception of a few facts out there about science, things like gravity, for example. But in environmental governance, very rare. So, but after that, it's really, I think, up to each individual to be comfortable with what degree of uncertainty they're going to accept. I really do not believe that anybody has come up with a magic number there that says if 75% of the scientists agree and there's 25% uncertainty, let's say, then let's make the decision there. It has something to do with a risk assessment. So if there's 25% uncertainty and the stakes are massive, like, we're not quite sure if the world's going to fall off the cliff and that's it, right? Then maybe we should strive. But then again, the timing. So there's a lot of variables that come into that. And yeah, I'm usually, 3 out of 4 scientists are saying something is occurring. For me, I'm starting to feel pretty comfortable that we're in a range where, I'm willing to stand on some decisions. But that's just me. There's other people who are going to disagree with that.
Not to put words in Dr. Calloway's mouth, but he would probably put in a pitch for adaptive management, right? I mean, that's why the Delta Reform Act and the Delta Plan are so heavily built on this concept of adaptive management, because you're not going to start from a point of perfect knowledge. There's going to be a lot of uncertainty, but you have to set goals and articulate, what your triggers are to adapt so that you can meet your goals once you get additional information.
Agreed.
And I was going to say, our chair would love 100% on all his votes, but there's some uncertainty with many of our votes.
I don't care about 100%, I just want to win.
Oh, you have been, let me assure you. You're talking about science, and I think the term you use, if you're in the club, there's another club. It's a political arena, and that's this body right here. 4 members are appointed by the governor, 1 by the Senate, the Assembly, and then I represent the Delta Protection Commission by virtue of being the chair. And there have been 3 people before me. We all have different approaches, different levels of knowledge. But I think what it really boils down to, and when I came on this council, I was given a lot of advice about trust and don't trust and verify. I can tell you that my experience has been a very good one. I think staff has been great, and my colleagues, even though we may disagree on occasion, we've always agreed to disagree. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that whether you agree or disagree on an issue, be it here or any other body, there has to be this level of respect and respecting the opinion of that other person or persons. When I first came on, Randy and I had a chat, and I said, I may be in the minority on many of my positions, but I have a voice and it ought to be respected. And I think Randy and I have agreed to disagree on many issues, but overall I've been very happy with his chair and also with my colleagues. I know I'm digressing a bit, but I think it's important to know that there are different clubs. And the club that I work in is a political one. And we need to recognize that maybe the minority voice has a position, may be a good one. Hopefully I can change the thoughts of some of my colleagues and get them to come along with me. But I haven't been successful, but I think I've at least made folks think about my position, because my position as virtue, again, as chair of the Delta Protection Commission, is I represent the folks that are immediately impacted by decisions that this body makes or will be making. So anyway, thank you.
I just want to make a comment on this. I think in my experience, I constantly deal with this issue of there's the clubs, as you said, and then the 2 big the divisions is like the political club and the science club. And a lot of times, leave alone that the political club is not one homogeneous thing, but for me, the struggle is always like scientifically, we do all this analysis and we get to a point, but then there's a point where the political club weighs in, and the decisions that come out of it is not necessarily the best scientific decisions. And it's a dilemma for a professional, a scientist, an urban planner, a person who worked crunching the numbers and coming up with the best solutions, yet at the end, something totally different happens. And it's just, it's something that I deal with my career for many, many years, and I don't know the answer. And I'm just searching in this discussion if anybody else in the room knows the answer.
Is that sausage making?
Yes. It is sausage making. And it's not always good sausage what comes out.
So Reiner, moving forward with the next 2 presenters, I think one thing, and either Liz or Deborah can maybe illuminate this, we need to better understand the relationship between the Ocean Protection Council and the Ocean Science Trust. And if that's part of that's great. But to help us apply what you're going to teach us to how to better govern the work that we do, we need to understand pretty clearly the interaction that takes place between the 2 organizations.
That was an excellent segue. Thank you. I am Deborah Halberstadt. I'm the Executive Director of the California Ocean Protection Council. I'm also Deputy Secretary of California Natural Resources Agency for Ocean and Coastal Matters. And I'm so pleased to be here, first of all, because I think this is just a fascinating discussion, and I have already learned nuggets that I plan to take back with me and that Liz and I can continue to talk about. And also because substantively, I think that there's a great partnership between the OPC and the Delta Stewardship Council that we can start to develop here, and particularly on issues like sea level rise, where the Delta communities, I think, are particularly affected and may not even realize how much they're going to be affected by this. And so it's an issue that we've been working on at the Ocean Protection Council, and I know the Delta Stewardship Council has been working on it and utilizing the guidance that Liz and my office put together. And so this is kind of a perfect moment for us to start thinking about how we can coordinate better. But as far as the governance and the structures of OPC and OST, so that's the Ocean Protection Council and the Ocean Science Trust. There's also a third body that is not represented here today, but that is the Science Advisory Team. The Ocean Protection Council has its own Science Advisory Team. So I'm going to walk through the three legs of that triangle. The way I always describe it is as a triangle, which is actually an adaptively managed construction of how these bodies have operated in the past. So OPC is really an innovative leader at the state level and globally as far as ocean and coastal policy. We are a cabinet-level advisor to the governor and to the legislature. We are comprised of the Secretary for California Natural Resources Agency, Secretary of Cal EPA, the Chair of the State Lands Commission, which alternates between the Controller and the Lieutenant Governor, a member of the Assembly, a member of the Senate, and 2 public members. And we, through coordination and partnership with our state partners as well as local entities often, and through grant making, we pioneer science-based policies to protect the ocean and the coast. We turn to the Ocean Science Trust and our Science Advisory Team in developing and in synthesizing and in understanding the science that will inform those policies. So the Science Advisory Team was created in the same statute that created the Ocean Protection Council. It's called COPA, the California Ocean Protection Act. And from that, we have drawn world-class scientists throughout the state of California who represent different disciplines and whom we can turn to when we have policy questions that require a scientific foundation. They will develop for us working groups, white papers, consensus statements on particularly tricky issues where we really need to provide some of those answers you were asking about. And they're responding to and premised on policy questions that we ask. So we come to them and say, we have these scientific needs. Can you please help us understand them? They also are in the process, we're developing a process by which they can advise us of issues we haven't even thought about that we need to know about. So as scientists, they are thinking ahead, they are looking, they're on the cutting edge of knowledge. Policymakers tend to be a couple years behind, so we can look to them and say, help us know what we should be anticipating that we're going to need help with in the future. And then the Ocean Science Trust, and Liz is the new executive director, but do not be fooled. She is the longest serving team member of the Ocean Science Trust ever. So she has deep, deep knowledge, historical and present. So although she just started as executive director, I would certainly look to her for thoughts on how OST has evolved over the past 10 years. But the Ocean Science Trust is a statutorily created 501c3. It is an independent nonprofit that was created by the state of California. It's the only nonprofit in California that is solely dedicated to California's vision of a healthy and productive ocean and coast. And it has a role in using science to accelerate progress to that vision. So OST acts as OPC's science advisor, and its team pursues projects and initiatives that draw together different and diverse perspectives to help, again, synthesize and interpret the science that can advance OPC's policy, funding, and management decisions. So we all work together, and there's a flow of information that has to happen among all of our entities. So OST is the co-chair of the Science Advisory Team. OPC sits on the executive committee of the Science Advisory Team. We have this three-way partnership where we need to be talking and communicating frequently with one another. in different ways and at different times. And it can get a little complicated. And I would say, over the past couple of years, we have been wrestling with a lot of the same questions that were brought up today. And Liz and her staff and I and my staff have come together not infrequently to think through, how do we properly define our roles and responsibilities? What do they look like? It gets messy. We start stepping into one another's territory. Is that okay? Can we just be comfortable with that mess, or do we need to more clearly delineate, this is what you do and this is what I do? And it can vary from time to time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Liz to talk specifically about some of the projects that I think have been particularly successful examples of collaboration between OST, OPC, and utilizing our SAT. And then we're both happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Deborah, and thank you so much for the invitation to join you here today. I'll reiterate what others have said, which is I learned so much from these kinds of conversations with colleagues about science governance. And as Deborah said, I definitely bring a practitioner's perspective. I have been living the mess, and it's lovely to feel the mess legitimized by academia occasionally. I've been with the Ocean Science Trust for, shockingly, a decade, but just recently took over as the executive director. And, I want to also reiterate a couple of the points that Mark made, that this concept of boundary spanning, of being an entity explicitly charged to live in the gap, the space, the legitimate space that exists between the clubs, that exists to and has accountability to the clubs, both academics, science in its broadest form, stakeholders, and accountability to the political and policy arena as well. And it's not easy. This is a difficult place to be, and no one solution is going to, as Mark said, solve everything at every place and at every time. So there are times when a JPA might look like the perfect thing to do. There are times when a nonprofit might look like the perfect thing to do. I think what I would put forward based on my experience is to devise a solution that has the flexibility to adapt and respond and mold and shape. And I definitely feel like we have grown from a small, scrappy, non-profit, upstart, young entity in California to a more mature organization today that has a robust relationship with the Ocean Protection Council and the Science Advisory Team that allows us to openly communicate about exactly what Deborah was saying, the roles and responsibilities and the ways in which those can flex to address a particular issue, be it ocean acidification or sea level rise or something else. I saw eyebrows raise when you heard that Ocean Science Trust is a 501c3 nonprofit. Yes, indeed. This was, to my mind, as Deborah mentioned, it's legislatively mandated, which is unusual. I actually don't know of another legislatively mandated nonprofit. There are other entities who serve a very similar role. Indeed, that list of science governance goals applies to Ocean Science Trust as it does to many other sort of boundary spanning entities that I know, but I do not know of another nonprofit serving this role. And to me, it was a very bold statement by California in 1999 when the legislation was first written, enacted in 2003, that valued science-informed decisions and valued independence so much that it was willing to say this is an important governance and government function, and we are going to outsource it and trust in the information that is delivered to us from a nonprofit from which we have relatively little control. And that was an important signal and statement about the value of independence. Now, there are important connections that we have to the state. Our board of trustees, like we are governed by a board of trustees like any other nonprofit, but it is we have named seats, and the majority of the trustees are appointed by the Secretary of Natural Resources. So there's this unusual connection that although we exist as a 501c3, we have a board that has named seats, and that includes representatives from the UC California system, as well as Department of Finance, Department of Natural Resources, and Cal EPA. And it's that expression in the board that is the expression of this boundary that we live and operate in between these clubs, these worlds, philosophies, and cultures and norms of the academic communities and the political and policy and management communities. So what I wanted to do is just to take a couple of moments to describe just two of the many examples of what that actually looks like in practice, and how we work together, because it does differ from example to example. So as many of you probably are aware, California has emerged from a decade-long effort to establish the statewide network of 124 marine protected areas where fishing is either restricted or prohibited along the coast. Midway through that process, the Ocean Science Trust was asked to take on the role on behalf of the state of designing the monitoring and evaluation program for this statewide network of marine protected areas. And this was an opportunity to do what is, again, so a rare opportunity. Natural resource monitoring, if I'm blunt about it, is often felt by academia to be mundane and boring and rote, and often felt by managers and regulators to be a burden on already stretched thin resources. So we wanted to take a clear-eyed and a fresh-eyed look at how to make marine protected area monitoring relevant, salient, and valued, so that it could be sustained in the long term. And we were in a unique position to be able to do so, because we were independent of government and independent of academia and the incentives. We actually took the unusual move of turning to the fishermen, turning to the environmental NGOs, and saying, look, the MPAs are going to be evaluated on the basis of your measures of success. What do you think we should be monitoring and evaluating into the future? And we can then take that and integrate that with the legislatively mandated goals. We could not have done that successfully as a government agency. We could not have done that successfully from within academia. And quite frankly, we could not have done it successfully if we didn't, as a practical matter, have the opportunity to blend both public and private funding support to do it. And it enabled us to enact a public policy kind of public participatory process for a science enterprise that we couldn't have done with the limits of what you can reasonably do with public monies, and we're able to generate additional synergies and leverage the value by applying philanthropic support to that. Turning to a second, and I'll just give two examples, of the issue of ocean acidification. So fast forward a number of years, and this is, I think, pulling on the thread of the value of having Ocean Science Trust as named science advisor to the Ocean Protection Council. Back, gosh, probably 6-7 years ago at this point, ocean acidification was just splashed over the media in Washington state, causing shellfish industry collapses. And became such a politically, hot topic there that a joint policy and science panel was convened by the state, and recommendations were produced from that. Here in California, the top officials at the appropriate agencies were beginning to feel the heat as well. And Cal EPA was facing lawsuits. But we don't have the same shellfish industry as Washington state to legitimize the same kind of response. So it was a moment in time where within the regulatory and management, natural resource management arenas in California, darts were starting to be thrown about this amorphous global change issue of ocean acidification as to whose responsibility it was. And because we were named science advisor, we were part of those conversations at Ocean Science Trust. And we were able to do that forward looking and say, look, this is one of those complex, wicked problems where a code dispassionate look at the science might be the way to break down some of these barriers, illuminate some pathways forward. You cannot do it on the basis of just a management and regulatory authority discussion alone. And so it was on that basis that we recommended the formation of a scientific panel to look at the issue of ocean acidification and how it relates to California regulation and management. And moreover, because we don't have the same kind of shellfish industry as Washington State, we were able to say, look, what you need to do is not just tackle ocean acidification alone, but add hypoxia to the mix. Because in California and the Southern California Bight, and indeed the Delta, that's what's relevant, is the changing ocean chemistry writ large, not just acidifying waters that are affecting oysters, as it was in Washington. So we with the support of the Ocean Protection Council, convened what ultimately became the West Coast Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Science Panel that has, I think, generated a degree of momentum and action and prioritization of ocean acidification and changing ocean chemistry that we couldn't have predicted it at the start, and even has led to California, with OPC's leadership, taking and leading an international alliance on ocean acidification. For our part, here at home in California, we are now convening, again on behalf of the Ocean Protection Council, an ongoing legislatively mandated science task force to continue to provide the advice needed on this issue, for which scientific knowledge is still rapidly advancing, and we need that flexible mechanism for receipt and delivery of new scientific information. So I'll close with just my own experience of to JPA or to not JPA. This has been a conversation that has taken place within the construct of the Ocean Science Trust over time, as we have wrestled with the deep value we feel of being an independent and NGO 501c3 with a unique connection to the state, but the challenges that presents for sustainability and long-term funding. I think the calculus, if you are to think about developing a JPA de novo, is probably different from our experience, because our experience led us to the conclusion of not doing so, but it was largely on the basis of adding a layer of governance to a layer of governance that already existed in a board of directors. But more fundamentally than that, it in our view, detracted from the unique value proposition of the independence of the nonprofit entity in making us beholden to the set of funders and the set of interests that those funders represented, and the ways in which, as Mark described, it potentially would narrow both the science disciplines and just the incentives to participate. And so I do think, though, that a layer of organization, whatever that organization, it is worth considering as we look forward to many more of these, what are termed these wicked problems of deep uncertainty and persistent uncertainties, where we shouldn't actually be trying to eliminate the uncertainty. But my response to your previous question about uncertainty would be to increasingly challenge the scientists to develop the frameworks by which they can represent and convey those uncertainties explicitly to you, so that you can weigh those and make your own risk assessments on them. And that's something that we did very explicitly with sea level rise. Legitimate uncertainties, persistent uncertainties, and we asked the scientists to convey those in a probabilistic fashion that illuminated those and gave it very explicitly to the decision makers. So I will pause there, happy to take questions.
This is all very good, and I have thoughts looking through the filter of what we're trying to do to consolidate efforts through the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee by creating a Delta Agency Science Work Group that with a representative from each of the key state and federal agencies to meet and discuss what are the scientific gaps. It's led to the development of the science action agenda. I see things that are happening to try and better coordinate without reworking the governance structure. The question I have for you all is that in the distributed way in which we conduct science in the Delta, there's a lot of data that's being collected, and it seems to me that one of the ways to coalesce a lot of efforts would be around the platform that needs to be created to collect and provide that data in a method that people can use. What's been the Ocean Protection Council's experience in data sharing, and data collection and data sharing?
I'll go first, and then okay. So this again, that's a huge question. I mean, I think management of data, given the abundance of data today, is a critical issue that that everyone is struggling with. So right now, the Ocean Protection Council is working with the state to develop this open data platform, and we are seeding information, particularly from our marine protected areas, but also ocean acidification data into the open data platform because we want it to be available and accessible to everyone. It's public data. It's collected either through citizen science or from scientific reports or from the projects that we funded. We want it to be available and accessible and usable. So we are working on that. That is a transition away from where particularly our marine protected areas data was housed previously, which was ocean spaces. And now I'm going to turn this over to Liz because she has more expertise in that.
I mean, I think what I would do is pick up what you're saying about the open data platform, because unlike many efforts that have been tried in the past for data integration. I mean, what is integration? When there is so many different data standards, so many different types of data, qualitative, quantitative, visual, traditional, that what I appreciate about this most recent effort is the flexibility of the system to accept with sort of like a tagging approach, multiple different kinds of data. Now, what that doesn't do is tell you what that data tells you writ large. So I would submit that data management, data collation, data integration is a first step, but it doesn't remove the need for human bodies to then take a look collaboratively at that data to come up with the assessment of what does it holistically tell us. And even if all of the right data is at the table, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be used. So what we value at Ocean Science Trust, and what I do think a JPA can do, is some of that crossing the boundary to illuminate for entities like yourselves, here are ways that you can consider using it. Here are the things you don't even know how to ask or that are options for you based on that data that you won't get if all you have is, here's all the right data. Have fun.
Well, we know in the Delta that about 80% of the science funding goes to collecting data, monitoring, and mostly as a result of biological opinion monitoring and regulatory requirements. And we've learned recently that a lot of that data is not analyzed. It's collected because it's required, but there's not enough funding to analyze it. And it begs the question, as technology improves and we are collecting more data, if we're already in a position where we can't effectively utilize what we're collecting and we're going to collect more, something needs to change. And so what you're telling us is that we probably, one, need funding to support the approach that you have just described, that would create someone or activate somebody that already exists or some group that already exists to take this information and provide it in a way that decision makers can weigh the risks and make decisions. Is that a fair assessment of what you just recommended?
100% yes. We wrestled with this actually as we were designing the MPA monitoring program on behalf of the state, and took a scenario planning approach of what if there were $2 million a year for X sized region? How would you allocate that funding for long-term monitoring? And ended in a place of only variable based on scenario, but only 60% targeted towards the classic, time series generation of monitoring, with the remainder allocated to the hypothesis testing kind of evaluations needed for adaptive management, together with this overlay of integration, synthesis, and delivery of useful products.
Can I back that up? This is something I hear so much. Like when I was working on sea level rise in the Bay Area, and we were talking about the climate science enterprise, get the data, I heard over and over again from local decision makers, not another data portal. They don't want another data portal. There's a lot of data portals out there. What they want is warm bodies, humans, taking the data, integrating it, delivering it to them in a way that, and that is so often overlooked. So happy to hear that 40%, but it's got to be in a way that somebody who's a decision maker goes to those people and says, what's the data, this is what I need, and that person has that job to actually do that translation. It requires a human being, not just data sitting on a server.
And if I could just add to that, one of the roles that OPC plays here is figuring out what questions we have to ask the scientists to analyze in utilizing that data. So there's the collection of the data that we fund, and then there's what are the policy questions that we're trying to answer with that data, and help us find the people who can answer those questions.
So to John or Reiner, in the Delta Science Plan, there was a call out for a policy science forum that has never gotten off the ground because I think it was kind of hard to figure out how to do. No, maybe not. My question is, was that recommendation or that approach designed to get at this type of interaction?
Definitely was designed to get at some of the synthesis issues of taking advantage of all the existing studies that are out there and making it available to decision makers. And through Campton CSAMT, there has been some effort to, and actually Scott Randall just presented a month ago or so to CSAMT about some of the synthesis, some of the integration of that into policy decisions around some of the Delta smelt issues. So I think we're making steps towards that, but and at both at the science conference as well as at the IEP meeting, the emphasis on synthesis and the need for more analysis and synthesis, and like Mark was saying, just not just collecting the data, but sitting down and evaluating it and seeing what the implications of it was definitely emphasized.
Yeah, and I think Deborah hit the nail on the head. It's like, what's the decision universe that we're looking at? And a lot of times the managers or decision makers don't always know what questions to ask. Mm-hmm. And you really have to go back to what is your immediate, 2 to 5 years of decision horizon that you can already anticipate, and look at it from the decision point of view rather than what questions do you have. But and so I actually had that follow-up question for Deborah. How has the Protection Council actually identified those big priority management needs or decision needs that you could then use as an entryway to develop the questions that then could be used by the scientists to formulate a coherent and usable answers or questions?
So that's a great question. I think there are a number of different paths that we follow. So one is just the staff expertise. My staff are all kind of experts in their respective fields, and so they have networks and people that they can talk to, and their own personal knowledge to understand where the questions are. At other times, we certainly turn to the Ocean Science Trust to help us develop those policy questions and say, we have this really big question. Can you help us narrow how we should be thinking about it? Or can you help us find the people who can help us narrow how we should be thinking about it? So there's a lot of, it's mostly, I would say, based on conversations with the people who know the most about it in the field.
I want to follow up on sort of this implementation side. So just to get a better understanding of the Protection Council and you know, the science that you provide, is that used by the state in the state ocean plan? Is it used by the Coastal Commission? Are you the source of science? You know, and I'm going to go to the state ocean plan and saying, gee, that's the major regulatory document that governs state policy relative to the ocean.
So there is no state ocean policy, and we do not have any regulatory authority.
Right, but there is a state ocean plan that the state water.
Well, there's a state
Resources
water
control.
board has an ocean plan.
That's what I'm talking.
So that's,
I know that. I know
separate,
that's
yeah.
not you, but it's sort of that's the regulatory framework for the state in terms of the ocean. For some, no, it's not. It's a very.
It's a very small portion.
So what is
from my
your-
perspective? It's a small
Okay,
portion.
so what is
So our
your authority?
jurisdiction, I mean, so as the Ocean Protection Council, our mission is to really think about overall protecting the health and the health of the ecosystem of the ocean and the coast. So we look at it holistically. The areas that we tend to work in are sustainable fisheries, the marine protected areas, policy guidance, climate change, and marine pollution. So marine pollution, we certainly work very closely with the Water Board on a whole slew of issues, but we look at it more broadly than just the Water Board's ocean plan. So we have partners across the state. We work with the Coastal Commission, we work with the State Lands Commission, we work with the Coastal Conservancy, we work with the Water Board, we work with the regional water boards, we work with we oversee the Coastal and Ocean Climate Action Team, and we convene that. So any entity that is thinking about climate change in relation to coastal or ocean work, we bring together. On the MPAs, we have a leadership team that brings together all of those entities I named, in addition to parks and tribes, and there's an MPA collaborative network, local NGOs. So we try to work across the whole spectrum.
Right, I'm trying to see if I could draw some parallels to what we do, you know, like the state board with the water quality control plan, you know, that's a part of what we do, but not the whole thing. But what do you implement?
So we
council
develop-
approves the MPAs and that, or does that have to go to the legislature? Or?
So it depends on the topic. We issue policy guidance documents. So for example, we issued a State of California sea level rise guidance document,
Right.
which was premised on the work that OST helped develop from the scientific foundation. We then took that document, the scientific foundation, and used that to develop a policy that is supposed to apply to all state agencies and also local governments.
So how did that happen? So was it something you put the guidance out and it was voluntary on their part, or
Yeah, so we put the guidance out, and we are working, in developing the guidance, we work very closely with our state partners, and they are integrating that guidance into their subsequent policies as the Coastal Commission looks at sea level rise in relation to residential housing, or as it looks at sea level rise in relation to permitting. They're using the guidance to inform their directives. We're also working with local governments. I've gone out to several different locations to talk to local governments. We're going to be hosting regional workshops to help them understand what the guidance is and how it can be implemented. And we also receive from our council, I received from the council a directive to understand what are the barriers and challenges in implementing the guidance. So we are trying to do outreach to understand what do you need help with in implementing this guidance? Where can we be useful? And then so our power, I would say, lies partially in our coordination and partially in our grant making. So we fund a variety of different projects, and under Prop 68, we received funding to assist communities in addressing climate change impacts from an ocean and coastal perspective. One of those will be sea level rise. And so as we develop our Prop 68 guidelines, we're thinking through how can we provide the technical assistance, how can we provide the capacity to help local governments implement the guidance.
So the designation of the marine protected areas, no. You don't, I mean, you don't, I know, I'm just saying ultimately it gets designated by someone, is that,
So they're already designated?
so they've already been designated?
Oh, they've been designated for
So
12
you're
years. Yeah.
you're just monitoring,
No, so the responsibility for marine protected areas is divided into different places. So the day-to-day management of the MPAs is actually the jurisdiction of the Department of Fish and Wildlife. OPC is responsible for the policy oversight of the MPA system.
I understand that we're utilizing the guidance document for our climate vulnerability work, and it's part of our considerations in the ecosystem chapter amendment.
Yeah, and you were actually one of the first entities to adopt our guidance or to start utilizing it. So that's one of the places where I feel like there is such great synergy, because we specifically and explicitly acknowledge we were not addressing sea level rise in the Delta. That was just like beyond the capacity of what the scientists could take on in the limited time frame that they had. But it is such a clear and important need. And as I said before, I mean, there are communities that may not even recognize how vulnerable they are to sea level rise, particularly when you start looking at storms and king tides and El Nino events. And so I think that the work that you're doing is incredibly important, and I would certainly like to find ways to highlight what you're doing and find those places where we can, as I go out and do regional workshops, if it's a region that's affected by, in the Delta, to have you there with me so that you can talk about what the science that you're doing and the analysis that you're doing and how they fit together.
just one last question on this. So within the state bureaucracy, all the state agencies, you released that guidance, and it was up to the individual agencies whether they wanted to incorporate that into their planning. It wasn't, something came out from the resources agency. There was nothing, it was just convincing them that this was something that they should use in
No, I would say so Governor Brown issued Executive Order B 3015,
Okay.
which requires state agencies to think about climate change adaptation in all of their policies and all of their rulemakings. There's also SB, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, SB 279 by Senator Jackson, which requires local governments to integrate climate change into their general plans. And then there's SB something else by Senator Wojciechowski, which creates ICARP, which is oh my gosh, I don't have all my notes in front of me, the Integrated Climate Adaptation Resource and Planning Entity, I think. But that brings together a whole variety of different entities who are supposed to be working on adaptation at a local, state, industry, NGO level. And it's like this clearinghouse, so they all come together. So each one of those helps disseminate our guidance and gives it some teeth, but again, we are not a regulatory agency. We can't
Right.
require anyone to use it, but we see in concert with the governor's executive order and the fact that this was adopted by the Ocean Protection Council, which has all of those members on it. So everyone within resources, everyone within Cal EPA, everyone within controller and the lieutenant governor and the assembly and the Senate and the two public members, it should be a pretty comprehensive.
So that was important, and you were the only ones that were doing the work, and somebody needed to use something, and you filled that need.
Yeah.
So that sounds like good synergy, and seems like it was important to have that executive order.
Yes.
And those bills. Okay, that's where I was trying to go.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you.